Hello, I'm Jeff, a Svelte maintainer and senior software engineer at OrderGroove. Svelte transitions and animations. Everybody loves them. In fact, they're usually one of the top 3 reasons people fall in love with Svelte, right next to simple state management and feeling superior about not having a virtual DOM. There are 7 built-in Svelte transitions and 1 built-in animation function, but today we're going to focus on 2, flip and crossfade. We'll talk about why we need them in the first place and how new browser capabilities might provide an alternative. Maybe. Let's start with animate flip. This is a directive that you can use inside an each block to make reordering the elements in that block smoother. For example, look at this row of playing cards. Clicking this button reorders them, but they abruptly jump to their new positions, and it's hard to understand what playing card moved where. But if I add animate flip to the individual DOM elements, they instead animate their new position, which is much nicer. It's worth noting that you do need to provide a key in your each loop, otherwise Svelte can't tell which card moved where. This is something you could implement in JavaScript, but you have to grab the DOM elements yourself and it gets a bit mathy, so it's nice that Svelte makes it as simple as adding a single attribute. But Svelte's flip only works in individual each blocks. In this demo, you can also click a card to select it and move it to a separate row. Here's what that looks like. If I want that transition to be animated, I need to reach for a different tool, the crossfade transition. First, we call crossfade to get the pair of transitions, and then apply them to the elements in each row. Here's where we apply it to the first row, and then the second. We pass a unique key so Svelte knows that when we remove an element from here, it's the same as the element we're adding down here, and should be animated to its new position. In this case, the key is the card's suit and rank, so for this card, the key is the string 10 hearts. Once we apply the transition, swapping the card will animate it to its new position. And we can now shuffle between rows too. If you haven't seen these before, go take a look at the official Svelte tutorial. They're pretty fundamental bits of Svelte API, so I'm not going to dwell on the particulars for much longer. So Svelte's flip and crossfade directives were introduced in 2019. Are there more options for animating UI states on the web in 2023? Well, yes. Let's talk about the View Transition API. The View Transition API has been developed in Chrome for a while now. You may have heard about it under its previous name, Shared Element Transitions. According to the API explainer, it makes it easy to change the DOM in a single step while creating an animated transition between the 2 states. Up to this point in browser history, we had the tools to animate individual elements, but smoothly transitioning elements between 2 UI states was still a hard problem, and people often reached for libraries to solve it. So this API introduces a new document method, start view transition. When you call it, it will start a view transition and capture the current state of the page. Inside a callback passed to the function, you update the DOM somehow, and once you're finished, it will capture the new state of the page and then smoothly transition between the old and new states. By default, it will fade the old state out while fading the new state in, but you can customize the transition in CSS, just like you would any CSS animation. In addition, this API also introduces a new view transition name CSS property, and you'll see how we use this in a bit. I'm barely scratching the surface here, so check out the official explainer for a much more detailed rundown. Let's look back at the demo we were working on before. How can we refactor this code to use start view transition instead of Svelte's animate flip and crossfade? I've reverted back to before we added those functions, so we have a blank slate. Let's look at the shuffle functionality. To have shuffling trigger a view transition, we can wrap the actual state updates inside of start view transition. The browser then needs to know when the DOM has finished updating. In Svelte, we can do that by awaiting the tick function. So with that, every time we shuffle, we have a transition happening, a fade. But that's not quite what we want, is it? This is because the browser only sees the old and new states. It doesn't know whether a card moved somewhere or was replaced. Just like Svelte needed a key, so does the browser, which we can do by setting a view transition tag on the element. Since this tag needs to be unique, I like to use a CSS custom property to inject the dynamic part of the transition tag. We can set the prop in a style directive, and then use it in our CSS. Like before, I can use the name of the card to make up the key, which is unique for this demo. And with that, the cards animate during shuffle. I want to pause for a moment to call out just how cool this is. We have elements dynamically moving to their new positions, and there's no JavaScript code doing calculations to make this happen. We didn't have to write it, and neither did Svelte. The browser is figuring it out for us. So, should you go out and yank all the animate flip and transition crossfade from your codebase in favor of this new browser API? Well, not necessarily. Each version has their pros and cons. Let's compare them. Let's start with the pros of the view transition version. First, as I mentioned, the browser does all the heavy lifting. You're also able to use CSS to customize the animation, which is especially useful if you want to use media queries, say to target different device sizes or reduced motion preferences. And because it's CSS animation, you can easily debug the animations using Chrome's animation dev tools. Also, there aren't any Svelte templating constraints. With Animate Flip, we had to be in an each block. But the View Transitions API doesn't care about that. This one probably isn't significant enough to matter, but we do ship slightly less client-side JavaScript since we don't need to include Svelte's flip or crossfade code. And because it's a browser API, the knowledge is portable. You can't use Svelte animations and transitions in other frameworks, but you can use view transitions. On the other hand, it also comes with some cons. It only works in Chrome, at least for now. While animation is a good progressive enhancement case, if this is broken, then your app should still work. Losing this animation completely in non-Chrome browsers may be a deal breaker. Hopefully, this won't always be a con as the API is implemented by more browsers. Until then, make sure to check the API is supported before using it. And while we can use CSS to customize the animation, targeting the animation for multiple elements can get wordy. If we wanted to change the animation duration for all of the cards, we would need to write a selector for every transition name we use. There's a proposal to solve this problem by creating classes of transition groups, but that isn't implemented right now. Finally, we have to wrap every function that triggers a view transition in document.startViewTransition. So if we also want swapping a card to transition too, we need to wrap it. Svelte transitions are more declarative in that you can add them to the element directly, and any state affecting that element will trigger the transition. So, while view transitions are great, they're not a drop-in replacement for the Svelte transitions you're already familiar with. And they're not really meant to be. They solve similar problems, but in different ways with different trade-offs. We didn't even talk about animated page transitions, arguably the headline feature of the View Transition API, and something that is tricky to do with Svelte's transitions today. Some of the cons I mentioned become much less relevant with the page transition use case. For example, for SvelteKit page transitions, you don't have to wrap every link that should trigger a transition. You only have to wrap a single navigation lifecycle hook. As much as we all love Svelte, it's important to also know about the web platform's APIs. There may come a point where Svelte is dead and gone, but the web platform is extremely backwards compatible, and browser APIs and fundamentals are here to stay. There's a good chance that view transitions will become an essential tool in your tool belt for years to come, especially as they gain wider cross-browser adoption. If you want to read more about Svelte and view transitions, head to my blog at geoffrich.net, where I'll have a written version of this talk as well as links to some further reading. I also recommend checking out my post on creating animated page transitions in SvelteKit using the View Transition API. Thanks for your time, and enjoy the rest of the talks.